On the morning of April 20th, 1999, students walked into Columbine High School with the same energy they carried every other school day. Backpacks on shoulders, music in their ears, laughter echoing through hallways. Nothing felt out of place. It was the kind of morning people forget about because it feels so normal. But hindsight would later turn this ordinary day into one of the most studied moments in American history. The school sat in Littleton, Colorado, a quiet suburban community just outside Denver. A place families chose because it felt safe, predictable, and stable. Parents dropped their kids off at school believing they were stepping into an environment designed to protect, support, and guide them. And in every visible way, that belief felt justified. As the sun climbed higher, Columbine High School functioned like any thriving American school of the late 90s. More than 1,900 students moved between classes, rehearsed for year-end performances, jokingly discussed prom outfits, and counted the days until summer break. Teachers prepared lesson plans. Sports teams planned their upcoming games. Life was simple, structured, and full of youthful routine. Nothing about that Tuesday morning signaled what was coming. Nothing hinted at danger. Nothing suggested that this community, a community built on connection, trust, and tradition, was about to face a moment that would redefine the nation's understanding of school safety. What happened at Columbine would not only break the heart of the community, it would expose vulnerabilities no one had fully recognized. Before that day, schools across the country operated under the belief that serious threats were rare, almost unthinkable. Emergency drills were basic, communication systems were limited, threat assessment programs were nearly non-existent, and the idea that something harmful could unfold inside a suburban high school simply didn't fit into the country's collective awareness. Columbine changed that. The events of April 20th forced law enforcement agencies, school boards, and government officials to look closer, to ask difficult questions about preparedness, early warning signs, and the hidden struggles young people sometimes carry. Policies were rewritten, emergency response tactics were upgraded, schools began adopting lockdown procedures, threat reporting tools, mental health programs, and preventative strategies designed to identify concerning behavior before it escalated. But before all those changes, there was just the school itself. Columbine had always been known for its strong school pride. It had a dedicated sports culture, football games that filled the stands, track meets that brought parents together, and a spirit program that energized the entire campus. Academically, it was respected. Socially, it was active. Clubs, performances, student government events. Everything you would expect from a well-rounded American high school was alive and thriving. The community around the school mirrored that energy. Families attended neighborhood barbecues. Parents volunteered in school activities. Students grew up together from elementary through high school. Littleton wasn't a place people associated with crisis. It was a place where futures were built, where children were raised with optimism, and where the idea of something catastrophic happening inside a school felt distant, almost impossible. That's part of what made the tragedy so shocking. Not only the event itself, but where it happened. A town known for calmness, a school known for opportunity, a community known for connection. Columbine may have been an ordinary suburban school, but after that day, it became a symbol of how deeply hidden dangers can exist beneath the surface of everyday life. And on that morning, as students found their seats and the day unfolded with quiet normalcy, no one, not parents, not teachers, not classmates, could have imagined that the world was about to change. In the years that followed the tragedy, investigators and psychologists would spend countless hours trying to understand how two teenage students from a seemingly normal community could plan something so devastating. Their names became known across the nation, but behind those names were two young individuals whose lives were far more complicated than they appeared. On the surface, they were just high school students, teenagers navigating the same confusing world of identity, friendships, pressures, and insecurities that many young people face. They attended classes, completed school assignments, interacted with peers, and participated in everyday school activities. To the outside world, there was nothing that clearly suggested they were capable of something extreme. And that sense of normalcy is part of what made their hidden lives so difficult to detect. Those who knew them described two very different personalities. One was often quiet, analytical, introverted, and withdrawn. The other projected a louder, more confident exterior. Someone who joked around, expressed strong opinions, and carried a rebellious attitude. Together, they formed a partnership built not on typical teenage friendship, but on shared frustrations, shared anger, and shared isolation. Behind closed doors, they began developing a worldview shaped by resentment, detachment, and an escalating desire to push back against the world they felt alienated from. They wrote troubling thoughts in journals. They recorded disturbing ideas on private videos. They nurtured a mindset that fed off negativity, rejection, and a sense of being misunderstood. It wasn't a sudden shift. It unfolded slowly over months and years, unnoticed by the people who saw them every day. Teachers remembered moments of strange behavior, but nothing that crossed the line into clear danger. Classmates recalled moments of anger, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for teenage stress. Parents saw their children dealing with typical adolescent struggles, not realizing the extent of what was happening beneath the surface. Even law enforcement, who had minor interactions with them before the attack, had no reason at the time to believe they were preparing for anything more than teenage mischief. The truth is, many of the warning signs were scattered, small pieces that only made sense when viewed together after the tragedy. One wrote dark essays for school assignments that made teachers uneasy, but they were interpreted as attempts at creativity. One showed interest in things that might raise eyebrows today, but in the late 1990s, there was less awareness about digital footprints and online communication. And in their private conversations, they reinforced each other's negative emotions, amplifying their anger and building an echo chamber that no adult was aware of. They planned in secrecy. They hid their intentions behind smiles, inside jokes, and what appeared to be normal teenage life. They filmed themselves speaking about frustrations with society, about feeling overshadowed, about their belief that no one truly understood them. To them, these private recordings were a release, a place where they expressed things they could never say out loud. But to investigators who reviewed the tapes later, they revealed a slow and persistent descent into harmful ideologies. Their social struggles also played a role. They felt disconnected from peers, misunderstood by classmates, and unseen by the world around them. Whether those feelings were accurate or merely perceived doesn't change the impact. Those emotions fueled the mindset that led them down a dangerous path. While many teenagers experience loneliness, anger, or bullying, the vast majority never take extreme actions. What made this pair different was the way they isolated themselves and fed each other's darkest thoughts without any outside influence to intervene. Some friends recalled moments of tension or strange statements, but without the context of what they were planning, those moments seemed like typical teenage dramatics. Some parents noticed shifts in behavior, spending more time alone, expressing more frustration, becoming more secretive. But again, these signs seemed common and harmless at the time. Nothing pointed to something as extreme as what would eventually unfold. In the end, the biggest tragedy of their story, aside from the loss suffered by the victims, was the number of opportunities that were overlooked simply because the pieces never came together in time. There were writings that seemed too dark. There were videos that seemed too obsessive. There were interactions with law enforcement that raised concern. There were complaints from classmates. But no single event was obvious enough to trigger serious intervention. It was only after investigators pieced together their history, reviewed their journals, analyzed their recordings, and reconstructed their planning timeline that a clearer picture emerged. A picture of two individuals who had been gradually drifting into a mindset of destruction, while everyone around them saw only fragments. Their story, as tragic as it is, serves as a reminder that warning signs aren't always loud. Sometimes they are quiet, subtle, and spread out over long periods of time. Easy to overlook when viewed one by one, but unmistakable when finally connected. And on the morning of April 20th, 1999, the world would learn just how devastating those unnoticed signs could become. Long before that Tuesday morning, the plan had already taken shape in their minds. Months before the tragedy, small decisions started forming the foundation of something far more dangerous than anyone around them realized. It didn't begin with one moment, one argument, or one event. It began quietly, with thoughts that grew stronger, conversations that grew darker, and a secret partnership that tightened over time. Their planning phase didn't look like something out of a movie. There were no dramatic clues, no obvious countdown, no bizarre outbursts that alarmed entire classrooms. Instead, their preparation unfolded in ways that blended into normal teenage life. They researched things privately. They wrote ideas in hidden notebooks. They discussed their frustrations in secluded spaces where no teacher or parent could overhear. What appeared to the outside world as two boys hanging out was, in reality, the development of a dangerous plan. Their journals later revealed how early the idea had formed. Small entries turned into detailed outlines. Complaints turned into blueprints. Their private conversations fed their resentment, turning it into something more calculated. They reinforced each other's bitterness, validating feelings that no adult ever heard and no supportive voice was present to counter. This echo chamber became the fuel that kept their plan alive. In the months leading up to the attack, they began testing boundaries. Some of their online posts hinted at anger and hostility. Their school projects occasionally raised eyebrows, but at the time, such assignments were brushed off as dark creativity or attempts to shock teachers. Friends noticed they were becoming more distant. A few classmates sensed something was off, but most assumed it was normal teenage moodiness. Meanwhile, the two of them worked quietly, staying careful not to draw too much attention. They talked in coded language. They kept their intentions hidden behind sarcasm and inside jokes. They worked around schedules and routines so nothing would appear suspicious. Every step was done in pieces, nothing big enough on its own to trigger alarms. Their mindset grew more intense as the months passed. They felt empowered by the secrecy, believing they were doing something nobody else could understand. They built a world in their minds where their anger felt justified. They convinced themselves that their actions would send a message. And because they had each other, that belief grew stronger. Alone, their ideas might have faded. Together, those ideas took root. As the date approached, they became more meticulous. Their private recordings showed increasing confidence. Their journal entries became less hypothetical and more decisive. They mapped out a schedule. They planned the timing. They rehearsed what they would do and how they would move. They even joked about it, not because it was funny, but because they believed they were in control. What made their planning so difficult to detect was how normal their outward lives continued to look. They still attended classes. They still completed assignments. They still interacted with people around them. On the outside, they were just two students nearing the end of the school year. But internally, they were counting down to a day they had imagined far too many times. The morning of April 20th, 1999, felt like any other day for the rest of the school. Students woke up early, rushed through breakfast, grabbed their backpacks, and made their way to class. Spring was in the air. Graduation was less than 2 months away. The day was supposed to be routine, but for the two of them, that morning was the final step. Their journals would later show that they woke up with full intention. They prepared quietly, avoiding contact with family members as much as possible, trying not to reveal the reality of what they were about to do. Every move they made that morning had been rehearsed in their minds. On the drive to school, the roads looked the same as always. Neighborhoods were calm. The school parking lot filled with cars just like it did every other morning. Students chatted on the sidewalk, talked about homework, joked about weekend plans. No one noticed anything unusual as the two arrived. After all, they had shown up to school hundreds of times before. But on this particular morning, something in their behavior stood out to a few classmates. One of them appeared tense, quieter than usual. The other seemed oddly focused, not as animated as he normally was. Some students later recalled brief glances or strange expressions, but nothing alarming enough in that moment to spark suspicion. In a school with nearly 2,000 students, small mood changes were easy to overlook. To the outside world, it was just another Tuesday. To them, it was the moment they had been preparing for. The next minutes would change everything. When the first unusual noises echoed across the school grounds, most students didn't process what they were hearing. Columbine High School was a busy place. Lockers slammed shut, doors opened and closed. Students shouted jokes across hallways. At first, the sounds blended into the natural chaos of a large campus. Some students thought someone was messing around. Others assumed it was construction noise or a senior prank. No one imagined the truth. The initial moments were filled with confusion. Students outside the school looked around, unsure of what was happening. A few saw people running, but their minds didn't immediately jump to danger. It was the late 1990s. Drills were rare, emergency procedures were simple, and schools were not places where people expected serious threats. Inside the building, the confusion spread quickly. Teachers stepped into hallways trying to figure out what was going on. Some believed they were dealing with a disturbance near the school's entrance. Others heard conflicting reports and didn't yet understand the severity of the developing situation. Students began rushing into classrooms, out of breath, panicked, trying to explain what they had seen or heard. But their words were broken and unclear, making it difficult for teachers to interpret the reality unfolding. Phone calls started pouring into the school office. Students dialed 911 from classrooms and offices, speaking in scared whispers, trying to describe something they themselves couldn't fully see. Dispatchers struggled to piece together the information. Different callers, different angles, different fragments of the same event. Some said there were loud bangs. Some said people were running. Some said they didn't know what was happening at all. And in that confusion, both the school and the responding officers faced a challenge unlike anything they had prepared for. Outside, teachers tried to usher students away from exposed areas. Some directed groups towards safer parts of the campus. Others led students into nearby neighborhoods. The chaos was immediate and unpredictable. Friends became separated. Teachers had to make split-second decisions, relying on instinct rather than training, because there were no established protocols for a situation like this. As law enforcement arrived, they were met with a flood of conflicting information. Early radio reports suggested multiple threats at different parts of the school. Some officers were told the activity was inside. Others were told it was outside. Others believed there were multiple perpetrators scattered across the building. In reality, most of the confusion came from frightened students trying to describe what they had seen while running for safety. Responding teams had never dealt with an active school threat of this scale. Standard police strategies of the time focused on containment, setting up a perimeter, waiting for specialized units, and keeping officers safe until a full tactical plan was in place. It was a method that made sense for typical crises of the era, but Columbine was not typical. The situation moved too quickly. Information changed minute by minute. Officers had to choose between advancing into unknown danger or waiting for backup procedures that were still being organized. The building itself added another layer of difficulty. Columbine High School was large, with multiple floors, hallways, side rooms, storage areas, and open spaces that were hard to monitor. For officers on the outside, determining where the threat was coming from became almost impossible. Some students fled through windows, others hid in classrooms. Teachers blocked doors with whatever they could find, and throughout the school, small groups huddled quietly, hoping someone would reach them soon. Certain parts of the campus became choke points. Some students were trapped in areas where they had limited visibility, unsure of where to run. Others heard loud noises echoing through hallways and couldn't tell how close or far the danger actually was. The fire alarms were triggered at one point, adding another layer of confusion. For many students, it was hard to know whether they should stay in place or move toward an exit. Fear and uncertainty filled every corner of the school. Outside, parents began arriving as news spread. Many had received frantic calls or messages from their children. Others saw early reports on local television. The area around the school became crowded with worried families, emergency vehicles, and reporters trying to understand what was unfolding. Parents stood behind police lines, pacing, crying, praying, hoping for updates. It was one of the most heartbreaking scenes of the day. Hundreds of families searching for information, desperate for reassurance. Meanwhile, SWAT teams formed and entered the building, moving room to room with caution. At that time, tactical units were trained to clear buildings methodically, checking each room one by one. It was a slow process, but it was the only structured method available in 1999. Every hallway held uncertainty. Every classroom had to be approached with care. Their mission was to locate the threat, secure the school, and get students to safety. But with outdated communication tools and little real-time information, it became an incredibly complex operation. Students who managed to escape described running through fields, parking lots, and nearby houses to get as far away as possible. Neighbors opened their doors to fleeing teenagers, offering safety and phones to call home. Many of those who escaped gathered at nearby parks or emergency staging areas where they tried to find their friends and process what they had just lived through. Inside the school, officers continued clearing sections of the building hour by hour. Eventually, they reached the library area, one of the central points of the crisis, and confirmed that the two perpetrators were no longer posing a threat. The long, painful process of evacuating students and teachers officially began. Some came out crying, some were silent, some were shaking and in shock. Officers guided them through hallways, down staircases, and out into the bright afternoon light, where they reunited with terrified parents who had been waiting for hours. By the end of the day, the school was secured, but the emotional toll on the community was only beginning. What happened inside Columbine High School would forever change the way schools prepare for emergencies, how police respond to active threats, and how the nation views the unseen challenges young people may carry. And as the sun set over Littleton that evening, the weight of what had happened began to settle in, not just for the families and students, but for the entire country. As the final students were escorted out of the building and reunited with their families, a heavy silence settled over the community. What had unfolded inside Columbine High School was still unclear to the outside world. Most people only knew bits and pieces, fragments of information shared through phone calls, overheard conversations, or early news reports. No one yet understood the full scale of what had happened, but the shock was immediate, and it swept through the town of Littleton like a wave. Parents held their children tightly, some crying openly, others simply staring in disbelief. Many families didn't speak at all. They were too overwhelmed, too shaken, too relieved or devastated to find the right words. For some, there was unimaginable grief. For others, there was gratitude mixed with guilt, confusion, and fear. The parking lots, sidewalks, and open fields around the school became gathering points for students who couldn't fully process what they had lived through. Friends hugged each other over and over, as if making sure everyone was real and present. As evening approached, the reality of the day started to sink in. Emergency responders began sharing more information with officials. Administrators started updating parents. News outlets went from guessing to reporting confirmed details. And across the country, televisions flickered with breaking news banners as millions of Americans tried to understand what had happened in a school that few had ever heard of before that day. Communities far from Colorado sat glued to their screens, shocked that something like this could occur in a place so ordinary, so familiar, so much like their own schools. Parents watched the footage with growing anxiety, imagining their own children in similar hallways. Teachers watched with a sense of dread, wondering whether they would have known what to do in that situation. Students watched with confusion and fear, realizing that the sense of safety they felt at school was not as guaranteed as they once believed. In the days that followed, the country searched for answers, but answers were hard to find. Early reports contained misinformation, rumors about motives, rumors about relationships, rumors about bullying, rumors about conspiracies. Because events were so chaotic and so unprecedented, the earliest narratives were inconsistent. People filled in the blanks with speculation, and the media, hungry to update viewers, repeated details that had not yet been verified. This confusion created a national conversation marked by frustration and sorrow. Some blamed the school environment, some blamed cultural influences, others pointed to mental health struggles or isolation. Many of the theories that emerged in those early days were later proven inaccurate, but at the time, people were desperate to make sense of something they couldn't comprehend. Meanwhile, in Littleton, grief turned into unity. Candlelight vigils were held in parks, churches, and community centers. Thousands gathered silently with candles held against the night air. Students shared memories of classmates. Parents offered comfort to one another. Religious leaders, counselors, and volunteers stepped in to support families. Posters, flowers, and handwritten notes covered fences, sidewalks, and public spaces. Music played softly as people stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning on the only thing they had left in that moment, one another. Schools across the country began reviewing their safety plans almost immediately. Principals met with staff. Police departments coordinated with school districts. Emergency procedures that had been considered sufficient only days earlier suddenly felt outdated. The idea of lockdown drills, which are now familiar to students everywhere, was introduced into national conversation for the first time. Parents wanted reassurance, teachers wanted training, communities wanted to prevent anything like this from ever happening again. Mental health professionals also stepped into the spotlight. Experts on adolescent behavior, trauma, and threat assessment were interviewed on national television. They spoke about warning signs that are often subtle, overlooked, or misunderstood. They emphasized the importance of communication between students and teachers, between families and schools, between peers and trusted adults. Their message was clear. Prevention requires awareness, not fear. In the weeks after the tragedy, debates arose in schools, workplaces, and living rooms across America. How could something like this happen? How could two teenagers hide such intense struggles? How could a community so peaceful be shaken so deeply? These questions didn't have simple answers, but asking them was the first step toward change. Columbine didn't only impact policy, it impacted perception. It shifted the way parents viewed safety in schools. It changed how educators watched for behavioral changes in students. It pushed law enforcement agencies to rethink their response tactics. It forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about isolation, mental health, and the hidden burdens some young people carry. By the time memorial services were held and the school finally closed its doors for investigation and repairs, the nation had been transformed. The tragedy became a defining moment in modern American history, a moment that marked the end of one era and the difficult beginning of another. And even though Littleton tried to move forward, the echoes of that day reached far beyond its borders, shaping conversations, policies, and awareness for years to come. In the days that followed the tragedy, investigators began the enormous task of understanding exactly what had happened inside Columbine High School. The school building, once filled with the energy of students and teachers, had become a carefully controlled investigation site. Teams of law enforcement officers, forensic specialists, psychologists, and analysts moved slowly from room to room, documenting every detail they could find. Their goal was not only to reconstruct the events of April 20th, but to learn from them, to identify what went wrong, what had been missed, and what could be prevented in the future. The first step was establishing a precise timeline. Because the day had unfolded with so much confusion, the early timeline was filled with gaps and contradictions. Officers collected 911 recordings, radio transmissions, student accounts, teacher testimonies, and security footage to piece together the sequence of events. Each minute mattered. They wanted to understand when the first signs of trouble appeared, how quickly it spread, and how long it took for responders to gain control. What they discovered revealed both strengths and major weaknesses in the emergency response system of the time. Officers learned that outdated communication tools slowed down critical information sharing. Radio channels were overwhelmed with calls. Some messages never reached the right units. Early reports suggested multiple threats in different areas of the school, which caused teams to split up and focus on places that turned out not to be central to the crisis. It became clear that law enforcement had done their best with the tools available, but those tools were not built for a crisis of this magnitude. Investigators also studied how the school itself responded. Teachers acted with remarkable bravery, guiding students to safety despite having little to no training for such an emergency. Some teachers kept classrooms calm for hours, others helped injured students until help arrived. But investigators also noted that the building's layout made it difficult for responders to move quickly. The hallways were complex, the rooms had limited visibility, and since schools at the time weren't constructed with modern security considerations, officers had to navigate unfamiliar spaces while trying to locate the threat. The findings led to a stark realization. American schools were not equipped for modern emergencies. At the same time, psychologists and behavioral experts focused on the perpetrators' backgrounds. searching for clues that might explain how their actions developed undetected. They reviewed diaries, videos, computer logs, and school assignments. They studied their interactions with teachers and classmates. They examined previous incidents involving law enforcement. The picture that emerged was one of two teenagers whose emotional struggles and harmful beliefs had grown slowly, quietly, and privately, hidden behind ordinary behavior that made detection incredibly difficult. Experts emphasized an important truth. Warning signs are often subtle. They can appear scattered, easily dismissed as typical teenage frustration or artistic expression. Some of their writings showed anger. Some of their projects had disturbing themes. But none of these alone would have immediately revealed what they were planning. And because adults only saw small pieces, a troubling essay here, a strange comment there, the full pattern remained invisible until it was too late. Investigation findings challenged many assumptions held by the public. Early media reports had portrayed the perpetrators in certain ways, as victims of bullying, as outcasts, as individuals seeking revenge. But investigators found that many of those early narratives were either oversimplified or entirely inaccurate. Their motives were complicated, shaped by psychological struggles, resentment, and a distorted worldview that developed privately over a long period of time. Importantly, officials emphasized that no single factor caused the tragedy. Not bullying alone, not mental health alone, not media influences alone. It was a combination of issues: emotional instability, isolation, ideological fixation, and the reinforcing effect of their partnership that ultimately led them down a destructive path. Experts stressed that understanding these complexities was essential for preventing similar incidents in the future. As investigators finalized their reports, they presented recommendations that would reshape school safety across the country. Among the most significant findings was the need for improved communication between schools, law enforcement, mental health professionals, and parents. Another major recommendation was the creation of threat assessment teams, groups trained to identify concerning behavior early, evaluate risk properly, and intervene before a situation escalates. They also highlighted the need for faster police response strategies. The traditional wait for SWAT model was no longer viable. Officers needed new training that emphasized immediate intervention during active threats. This single change became one of the most influential lessons from Columbine, eventually transforming law enforcement procedures nationwide. By the end of the investigation, one message became clear. The tragedy at Columbine exposed weaknesses that had existed for years, weaknesses no one had recognized until it was too late. And while the findings could never undo what happened, they became a foundation for change that has since shaped the policies, training, and awareness of an entire generation. The tragedy at Columbine did not end with the investigation, or the memorials, or the national grieving that followed. Its impact extended far beyond Colorado, reaching every corner of the United States and influencing systems that had never before been questioned. In the months and years after the event, Columbine became a defining turning point, not just for schools, but for law enforcement, policymakers, educators, psychologists, and families everywhere. One of the most immediate long-term changes was the transformation of school safety. Before 1999, emergency drills inside schools were typically limited to fire drills or tornado drills. The idea of practicing for internal threats was almost unheard of. But after Columbine, schools across the nation realized that they needed new strategies that gave both students and staff a clear understanding of what to do in moments of uncertainty. Lockdown drills were introduced into mainstream education for the first time. These drills taught students how to stay silent, stay out of sight, and remain calm until help arrived. Teachers were trained to quickly secure classrooms, cover windows, and guide students with confidence and composure. While these practices were difficult for communities to adjust to, they became essential tools for maintaining safety. Another major shift occurred in law enforcement response tactics. Before Columbine, the standard approach to any major threat was containment, creating a perimeter, waiting for specialized teams, and preparing a full tactical plan before entering. But investigators determined that this method was too slow for fast-moving school emergencies. As a result, Police departments nationwide adopted the immediate entry model, where officers are trained to move toward the threat quickly rather than waiting outside. This single change has been credited with saving lives in later incidents. Columbine also sparked the rise of threat assessment programs, a system that allows schools and law enforcement agencies to evaluate concerning behavior early. Counselors, teachers, administrators, and officers work together to examine warning signs. Whether it's troubling writing, sudden behavioral changes, threats, or signs of emotional distress. Instead of viewing these signs in isolation, threat assessment teams look at the full picture, identifying when a student may be in crisis and needs intervention. This approach has become a cornerstone of prevention in modern schools. Beyond security policies, the tragedy had a profound effect on mental health awareness. For many years, discussions about emotional struggle, depression, or social isolation were often dismissed or minimized. But after Columbine, experts began speaking openly about the importance of supporting students who feel disconnected or overwhelmed. Schools expanded counseling programs. Communities invested in youth outreach. Parents were encouraged to look for behavioral shifts in their children, not with fear, but with compassion and attention. The cultural impact was equally significant. Columbine became a symbol of lost innocence, a moment when the country realized that the world had changed. News coverage, documentaries, research studies, and public discussions continued for decades, each offering different analyses and lessons. Students who grew up in the early 2000s did so in a world shaped by the events of 1999. The phrase school safety took on a new meaning. Conversations about empathy, accountability, mental health, and communication became more central in classrooms and homes. Even school architecture evolved. New buildings were designed with safer layouts, better visibility, improved communication systems, and alternative evacuation routes. Security cameras became common in hallways. Visitor check systems became standard. The idea of having a dedicated school resource officer on campus grew rapidly. While these measures could never guarantee complete protection, they reflected a lasting commitment to minimizing risk. And then there was the emotional legacy, the empathy that spread across generations. Columbine reminded America that behind every classroom desk is a young life filled with dreams, fears, insecurities, and potential. It reminded the country that families carry silent burdens and that communities thrive when people pay attention to one another. The tragedy revealed the importance of listening, of reaching out, of noticing when someone feels isolated or distressed. As years passed, the name Columbine stopped being just the name of a school. It became a lesson, a warning, a reminder, a conversation point for parents, teachers, police officers, and lawmakers. It influenced training programs. It shaped school policies. It pushed society to confront the challenges young people face and the importance of creating environments where they feel understood, supported, and seen. Even decades later, the impact of that day continues to influence American life. The changes that followed were born out of immense pain, but they also sparked progress that continues to protect countless students across the country today. As the years passed, the story of Columbine evolved from a breaking news headline into a defining chapter of modern history. The tragedy left scars that the community of Littleton still carries, but it also left lessons that continue to shape how America understands safety, empathy, and responsibility. And even though time has created distance, the echoes of that day still influence how schools prepare, how law enforcement responds, and how communities look out for one another. When people reflect on Columbine now, they don't just remember the events of April 20th. They remember the strength of the survivors, the bravery of the teachers, the courage of first responders, and the unity of a town that refused to be defined by tragedy alone. They remember the families who found ways to honor their loved ones. They remember the students who stood together in the days that followed, supporting each other in ways that no classroom lesson could ever teach. And they remember that change, real, lasting change, often comes from moments of deep heartbreak. Columbine forced the country to confront questions it had never asked before. How do we identify emotional distress early? How do we support young people who feel lost or invisible? How do we create communities where students feel safe speaking up when they notice something concerning? How do we build schools where every student feels seen? Those questions do not have simple answers, but asking them is what sparked a new era of awareness. In many ways, the legacy of Columbine is not defined only by the tragedy itself, but by the reforms, the policies, and the conversations that continue to protect students today. It became a reminder that vigilance is not fear, it is care. Awareness is not paranoia, it is responsibility. And compassion is not weakness. It is one of the strongest tools a community can hold. For countless families, the story of Columbine remains personal. For educators across the nation, it remains instructive. And for young people growing up today, it remains a solemn reminder of the importance of speaking out, supporting one another, and taking every sign of distress seriously. The tragedy cannot be undone, but the lessons it taught continue to guide an entire generation. As this documentary concludes, one truth stands out. Safety is not just about procedures and policies, it's about people, about listening, about noticing, about caring enough to intervene when something feels wrong. The story of Columbine reminds us that protecting our communities begins long before an emergency. It begins with conversation, compassion, and connection. And now I want to hear from you. Do you believe schools today are safer than they were in 1999? Which lesson from Columbine do you feel society still struggles to address? And what do you think is the most important step communities can take to prevent tragedies like this in the future? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might be part of the awareness that keeps another student safe. And if you want more deep, respectful true crime stories that explore not just the events, but the lessons behind them, then subscribe to Crime and Conscience. This is the channel where every story meets reflection, awareness, and understanding. Your support helps us tell these stories the right way. Thank you for watching. Stay aware, stay compassionate, and stay safe.